Hi, I'm Diane Dunlap, and today I'm going to be going over integrating Azure Active Directory user accounts with the Zscaler content filter. And this is done through SAML. Hi, I'm Diane Dunlap with MCNC, and today I will be going over integrating Azure Cloud Active Directory user accounts with the Zscaler content filter. And this is done through SAML. Here's a list of what we'll be covering. So we'll do a discussion of SAML, Azure Active Directory setup, and how to set up Zscaler. We're going to talk about AAA, so your authentication, authorization, and accounting, things to watch out for in doing this, and also how to use Powershell to add Azure users to the cloud. So what is SAML? Well, it is XML based. It's a standard for exchanging authentication and authorization data between an identity provider, in this case it would be Azure Active Directory, and a service provider. Service providers would include Dropbox, DocuSign, and actually Google. Google can get identity information from Azure, which is kind of weird, but yes, it can. They have hundreds of applications listed at the Azure website where Azure can be used as an identity provider for these applications. And one of the applications is Zscaler. Zscaler 1 actually, which would be your UI. So in this case, the service provider would be Zscaler. Okay, so why would you want to use Azure Active Directory? Well, if you have no other way of doing authentication and you want to move to something in the cloud, Azure would be a good option. If you're using Office 365 and that kind of thing, maybe you would want to use Azure as a source of authentication. Since it's not a true single sign-on, it's more like a sign-on and a half, it's still better than 2 logins though, okay? Because you would synchronize your Zscaler login to Azure and have one username and password to remember. There are 2 levels of Azure that are free at no charge to the schools. So instead of having an on-site Active Directory, that might be a good option. You can also apply filtering policies based on Azure department, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. Okay, disadvantages. Well, we talked about how it's not a true single sign-on, but it's a login and a half. Still better than 2 logins. Also, the SAML assertion cookies may be persistent depending on the browser and the kind of device you're using. Okay, so I'm going to kind of show what the login would look like. Okay, if you were using Azure, I've got a couple web clips here. Yeah, and okay, so in this case, we are going to be first hitting our email. Okay, so we're first going to hit our Azure portal, log in with our email. After that, we're going to go to a website. We want to go to Craigslist. Zscaler says, "Who are you?" And notice we're having to enter our username only once, okay? Because it talked to Azure. It's actually a loop here. It actually talked to Azure on that second process. Zscaler was asking Azure, hey, are they okay? And Azure says, yes, they are. Okay? Second scenario is first, we're going to try going to a website. Okay? We tried going to Craigslist. Zscaler sent us to Azure before it would let us go to Craigslist. Went to Azure, and all of a sudden we're on Craigslist. And again, that's just kind of looping, but that is basically how it works. Okay. So as you can see, it is a login and a half, still better than 2 logins. So for our A's, what are our A's? Well, authentication is who is the user. Authorization is what is the user allowed to do. And we're going to show use of the department field in Azure a little bit later. And accounting, that information appears in Zscaler, and that's where we can see what did the user do. And that would be looking at the Zscaler logs. So if you're currently not using Azure, you might be using on-site Active Directory. And this is how your authentication flow would look. You've got your inside user, your outside user. Whether they're inside or outside, they're going to hit that Zen node from Zscaler. Zscaler is going to send an LDAP query to your inside Active Directory, which will come back with a response to Zscaler. And it would have to be an affirmative before the user was allowed to go to the internet. Okay? That might be what you're currently doing. Or you might be currently using the hosted database. Hosted database is where you either manually enter users in the GUI using, well, the Zscaler GUI, or you can put the users in the spreadsheet and upload them to Zscaler. If you're using the hosted database, whether your user is inside or outside, when they hit that Zen cloud, one Zen node in Zscaler checks with the other Zen node to see if the user is okay to go to the internet. Okay, so similar to Active Directory, but it's one part of Zscaler checking with the other part of Zscaler. Okay, if you decided to go to Azure SAML, this is what the authentication flow would look like. Your inside or outside user, they're going to hit the Zscaler cloud, and instead of checking with inside Active Directory or hosted database, Zscaler talks to Microsoft Azure. And we see the SAML traffic in between Zscaler and Microsoft Azure. Okay, if we're thinking of moving to Azure Active Directory, what kind of things would we have to think about before doing this? We can't just turn it on. One thing to think about is if you have the user accounts in Azure Active Directory. Do the users know what's going to happen when authentication gets turned on, especially the lower grades? What are they going to do when they see kind of a captive portal thing display by Zscaler? Are they going to know what to do? Do we need to exclude websites from authentication outbound or destination websites? Do we need to exclude any of those from the authentication process? If we're going to do authorization based on groups, or well, departments in this case, do we have rules in Zscaler, and do we have that department field populated in Azure? So those are some things to think about if you're considering moving to Azure and Active Directory. Okay, so how would you know if you have authentication on currently at your site? If you have authentication set to authenticate only once, you will be authenticated only once because the cookie gets stored. So you might have authenticated months ago and not realizing that your traffic is still being tracked. But if you go into administration locations in Zscaler and expand your location, you can see where this column where it has authentication, if your column says authentication is enabled, you are doing authentication at your site. If you have offsite users, you will not see an entry, a row for your offsite users, but if you have any kind of road warrior traffic with pack files, they are being authenticated, even though it will not show here. So moving to Azure for authentication would also affect those users. Okay. What we're illustrating here is you can have authentication on or you can have authentication off, but you can't mix authentication types. So you can't have some users doing Active Directory, others doing Google SAML, some using Azure SAML, some using hosted database. It can't be a mixture, but it can be on or off. Okay? In a transition period, you could say, well, I'm going to move to Azure, but I'm not sure if I got it set up right. You would probably have to turn off authentication for your sites and then gradually turn it on if you really weren't sure how Azure was going to do. We also have the option of setting up like a lab or a few PCs in our beta cloud, so you could see how Azure works. We can do that. Okay. We talked about how in order to get through Zscaler, we would need to authenticate with Azure. And if we're not excluding some of the Microsoft sites, we won't get to Azure to get through Zscaler. So we get into this kind of chicken and egg situation. And here we're showing how one would kind of need to punch a hole in Zscaler and tell it not to authenticate the Azure Microsoft sites. And there are 10 different Microsoft destinations that we need to exclude from authentication and SSL decryption. Okay? So we create a custom list in Zscaler. In this case, we just called it Microsoft. We list our 10 sites. We save and we activate. And under Administration Advanced Settings, we exempt our Microsoft list from authentication. And we also exclude our Microsoft list from SSL decryption under Policy SSL Inspection. And of course, we save and we activate this. Now, if you're using a PAC file instead, of course, we need to exclude those sites from the PAC file. So this would generally be your offsite users. They need to be able to get to the Microsoft sites to authenticate before getting through Zscaler. Okay, so we're just saying don't authenticate the traffic that goes to Microsoft, return direct. They can go right there and authenticate, and then would be going through the Zscaler nodes for their remaining traffic. So how do we turn on SAML in Azure? Well, first we're going to look at our users so you can get a feel for what our users look like. Our domain is k120365.mcnc.org. Very standard first name, last name, and display name on our users. And Microsoft has a good tutorial on doing this. It got me up and running pretty well. There is a legacy UI in Microsoft, and their tutorial is geared towards the legacy UI. Okay. There was one site where I set this up, and they were using the new UI. So I've created a Google Doc that's visible to the world for both the legacy UI and the new UI in setting this up. So we'll go ahead with turning on SAML in Microsoft. So we go into our domain in Microsoft, and we choose Applications, and we want to add an application. We're going to add an application from the gallery. And in the gallery, there might be a number of Zscaler applications because there's actually Zscaler, Zscaler 1, and all of the LEAs are on Zscaler 1, Zscaler ONE. I think there might be a Zscaler beta out there, so make sure you choose Zscaler 1. And this looks a little bit fuzzy, but this represents Zscaler 1. So once we've chosen that, we say configure single sign-on. And the icon here, it's the Zscaler icon, but it actually is Zscaler 1 that we're in. It's just they're using the same icon for whatever. Configure single sign-on. And next screen, we're going to do Microsoft Azure AD single sign-on. And on this next screen, this will be the same for every LEA or charter school. Okay? This https://login.zscaler1.net:443:ssc_ss0 or SSO. Same for every site. So we hit next. On the next screen, where we have this rectangular box down here with a long number of characters in here, this is not the same for every school. So you need to copy this off and save it to Notepad, okay? The certificate, that would also be different on a per school basis. So you need to download the certificate, put it in your desktop or wherever, a safe place. Then down below, confirm that you've configured single sign-on and go to the next screen, okay? The next screen, it's just wanting to send you a notification that somebody's been in here configuring it, and it's you. Yes, you know that. So you go to the bottom right and hit the checkbox, okay? So we configured single sign-on, but unlike Google, when you configure SAML, in Google you can say turn it on for everybody or turn it on for certain OUs. In Azure, you're having to actually do an assign accounts, okay? I guess it makes sense because Azure can talk to a lot of things, like it can talk to Amazon Web Services, Dropbox, and maybe you don't want everybody to do Amazon Web Services or Dropbox, okay? So we go into the assign accounts area, and we have a new user, and you can see in the far right column where they are unassigned. In other words, they're not assigned to use Zscaler 1. We highlight them, and at the bottom, we hit the Assign button. After we hit the Assign button, they will appear in here as direct. Not really user-friendly, but I mean, that direct meaning that they've been assigned to be able to use Zscaler 1. Okay? And on the certificate we downloaded, because we were getting ready to configure Zscaler, it needs the certificate within a different format than Microsoft provides. So as provided by Microsoft, the Cert has a .cer extension. We have to convert that. So we just take the certificate, you can copy it within your Microsoft settings and just give it a .pem extension. Okay? So we're getting ready to do Zscaler. Since we're going to be making some changes in Zscaler, we need to do a backup of Zscaler to begin with. So we go into Administration, Backup Restore, and you can see how we can add a restore point up here. We're going to do that or make note of what our settings have been in the past so that if we did need to back off, we can do that. So we're making a backup, and we need to be thinking about authentication. Are we just going to surprise the users and turn it on? Are we going to temporarily turn authentication off while we're working on this Azure project and then turn it on gradually? But now's the time to think about doing that. Also, what we sometimes run into is LEAs might have a different extension, whether it's Google or Azure or Active Directory, than their Zscaler UI, okay? You can see here where our domain in Zscaler is k12gaps.mcnz.org. That was our primary domain, and that was actually our Google domain. When we got ready to do some Azure testing, we had to have our domain added for Azure, because our Azure domain is k12o365.mcnc.org. And sometimes we see folks who have students.whatever, okay? So whatever your extension is, whether it's in Google or Azure, we need to be sure the domain appears here. So if you're thinking about going to this and this doesn't match in your setup, please let us know and we will work with Zscaler to get this added. Okay? So we're ready to configure SAML, and we're going to go under Administration, Authentication, Configure SAML. And up top, if you remember, this is on the top left, you remember when we saved that long string to Notepad, that's what we're going to put in here on the top left, that string. And our login name attribute is always going to be name ID. So capital N, AME, then ID, caps. And that certificate that we converted, we gave it a different extension, a .pem extension. We're going to upload it here. Then down below, we're going to enable SAML auto provisioning. which we'll talk about later. Okay? So once we've done that, on our next screen, we're going to hit Save. And of course, we always have to activate in Zscaler. Okay, so if we have authentication on, well, if we don't, we have to turn it on. In our case, we just went into administration, locations, we expanded our site, we found the location where we're going to do our testing, might be a lab, might be a single PC. We hit the pencil, you don't really see the pencil, it's over to the right, but we hit enable authentication, save, activate, and as you can see, for odd users in the lab, which are odd numbered IP addresses on DHCP server, those users would have to authenticate to Azure. Okay. So basically, that is Azure authentication. That is how to turn that on. But suppose we want to turn on authorization or have authorization working because we want to make a distinction between types of users, teachers and students, or high school and elementary school, honor roll students, or people who have to do yearbook, that kind of thing. We would need to add authorization for that. And authorization is what the user is allowed to do. It's based on the user's membership in the department. So we see our same users as we did before, but we see in our fifth column over here, we have our department. And that's how we make a distinction in Zscaler as far as what these users are allowed to do is based on their Azure department. And here we're showing in Azure how we add a new user. And the department field is probably not one you're using, but if you look under work information, you will see where it is available to use. In this case, we populate it with department of new user. And hit save on that. So we've got a department in there in Azure, at least for this user. And it's a minor limitation, but Zscaler only processes the first department if you have multiple departments in Azure. It's unlikely you would have multiple departments in Azure, but it is a minor limitation. In Azure, we also have to tell Azure to send the department to Zscaler because it doesn't do that by default. So we go back into our Azure application, Zscaler 1, where we were before, but this time we go into attributes. And we add a user attribute, and in the pull down, we say user.department, and we call it department 2, okay? So Azure has the attributes populated, Azure is ready to send the attributes to Zscaler, and we have to go into Zscaler and tell it to receive the field, okay? Otherwise, it won't pay any attention when that department field comes over. So we go into that same area where we were before, administration, authentication, SAML, and we make sure that the department is filled out below. And of course, we hit save and activate. And after we do that, when our new user authenticates for the first time, Azure will send that information over to Zscaler. And you will see where that is appearing now in the department area under administration, user management. Now this is a little different than on-site Active Directory. And it's maybe more of a SAML issue than it is an Azure issue because we see the same thing with Google. If you've ever set up Active Directory with Zscaler, the minute Zscaler goes in and talks to Active Directory, it asks your local on-site Active Directory for a give me everything you got. And Active Directory reports all the users and groups, and you get all the machines, and you get all that stuff you maybe don't want, but you get that all in Zscaler. Because SAML does an auto provisioning, which we looked at a little bit earlier, you're not going to see users and groups and departments, well, not groups, users and departments appear in Zscaler until those users start coming in, okay? The problem is there, if you decide to make rules in Zscaler based on departments, you will not have those departments available until the first user with that first department comes over. It's more of a SAML thing, I think, than an Active Directory thing. Not a huge limitation, but it's just something to keep in mind. That is the way it works. Okay? So our first user has come in, they have a department, and you can see now where we can make policies based on department. So we add a rule, we want to block other games, we want to block social networking for anybody in that Azure department of new user. Okay? And accounting, okay? Zscaler accounting, it's going to be under your Web Insights area. If you go to the top right and click Department, that will make the department field appear in accounting. Okay, as you can see, and actually these are Google users, but the users will appear if you have authentication on, but the departments will not appear unless you tell Zscaler, I want to see the department. Okay, so we choose department, and after choosing that, we go from having the default department, which is what we had before, to having department of new user. Now, if a user didn't have the department field populated in Azure, we would see default department in Zscaler because it wouldn't know the department of the user. But if it does know because Azure has sent that, we would see that here. Okay? All right. So how would we get these users from our from wherever we want to get them up to Azure? When I first started working on this project, I started working with PowerShell on Server 2008 in the lab and Server 2012 in the lab. But then it occurred to me, well, chances are, if it's a charter school, small school, or whatever, going up to the cloud, they're going up to the cloud because they don't have Server 2008 or Server 2012. And so I got this all going on Windows 7. But any of them work fine. And you can use PowerShell to automate adding user accounts and departments to the Azure cloud. The user accounts can be in your CSV file, or if you're using PowerSchool and you're downloading files from PowerSchool, we'll look at that format in a little bit, you can use PowerSchool files to populate Azure. And whether you're adding users through the Azure GUI or using PowerShell to do that, Azure will generate passwords for your users, and you will have to provide those passwords to the users, and they will have to change them at their first login. Okay, in order to use PowerShell to add users to the cloud, I found you have to have 4 pieces of software installed. You may already have some of these installed, like the Microsoft NAT Framework and the Windows Management Framework. The latter 2 you probably don't have installed, but they do need to be installed in order to have PowerShell talk to the cloud. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hopefully do a live demo here of how to use PowerShell. So I've got PowerShell on my desktop. I'm going to choose Run as Administrator. Okay, and here we see our PowerShell. And it's probably a good idea to create a directory that you're going to dedicate to having your scripts in. And mine is the scripts directory. If you didn't have a scripts directory, you're just going to say make directory XYZ or whatever. It'll come back and assure you that that's been done. Okay, and we talked about how you need to have Azure communicating with the cloud. Our first thing we need to do in PowerShell is set execution policy remote signed. Okay. Oops, did something wrong. Set hyphen